Hi everyone, we will be discussing the consequentialist ethics. Consequentialism is one of the main ethical theories of the past few hundred years. Very generally put, it stresses that the focus of an ethical matter and its ethical weight resides on the person or agent by way of that person's actions or consequences. In other words, this focus and weight lead to quantifiably useful or generally positive ends such as the well-being of humans and animals. There are a few different kinds of consequentialism that we'll be talking in this lesson. Utilitarianism is the most dominant and the easiest to understand of the major consequentialist theories. At its most basic level, utilitarianism states that if one can increase the overall happiness of the world or that of an individual or just make the world a better place, then one should. In fact, one has a moral obligation to do so. So the pursuit of happiness is the thing that separates utilitarianism as set forth by British philosopher Jeremy Bentham from 1748 to 1832 from other forms of consequentialism. So this makes utilitarianism a relatively sunny and easy to get behind ethical theory. After all, everybody wants happiness or enlightenment or peace. But it's actually a quite complicated theory to apply to daily life because outcomes or consequences are based on happiness. Utilitarians are tasked with making predictions, judgments, or claims about what they think makes any one consequence good or bad. Even though the end goal is maximum happiness, acting in a utilitarian way requires impartiality. You're after overall universal happiness, not necessarily the thing that feels the best or nicest in that moment for you or the other person you're interacting with. So, Bentham explained that the way to judge consequences on that sliding but definitive scale of good and bad is the amount of happiness, pleasure, or benefit they lead to for one person, and then weigh those consequences against the amount of pain, suffering, and struggle it might cause to another. Bentham defines his core thesis, which he called the principle of utility. Bentham defined the goods of happiness and pleasure and the absence of pain and suffering as his core thesis. He called it the principle of utility. Utility is about purpose and use, and there is usually little emotional meaning attached to the word utility. It just means the thing that works best is the best thing. Bentham, however, called pleasure utility because he put it in such high esteem. At its essence, utilitarianism is a theory in which good or moral consequences and thus moral actions are defined in terms of an end result that leads to as much good as possible and as little bad as possible, or at the least more good than bad. So the goal is shoot for 51% or higher on the good side of an issue. It is in analyzing and weighing consequences that Bentham made his most lasting contribution to moral philosophy. For example, the different consequences from an action can and most often will be notably different from each other. So Bentham quantifies the moral aspects of actions in this way. The greater the good of an action, the more hedons or happiness or positive utility units it's worth. And the following will give us the idea of how to somehow judge the happiness or measure its positive utility units. First, we ask of the intensity. What is the intensity or level or pleasure and or pain that the action leads to? In terms of the duration, what is the duration of that pleasure or pain the action creates? With certainty, you can ask, is there a notable amount of certainty or uncertainty of pleasure or pain resulting from the action? When it comes to propinquity, how soon after the action does the pleasure or pain kick in? Is it near or far? For example, the benefits of eating healthy take a while for the benefit to kick in the form of a lower cholesterol level over time. But eating a cheeseburger, the pleasure is immediate, right? So when it comes to fecundity, how likely is the action to be followed by even more pleasure or pain? When it comes to purity, how pure or impure is the pleasure or pain after an action? As an opposite of the previous metric, this asks how likely the feeling after an action is to be followed by the exact opposite. When it comes to extent, what is the extent of the effect of the action? So can you imagine going through this process multiple times a day to make a decision to see if it's moral or not? Using Bentham's system of determination requires slow, deliberate action. There is also the indirect approach, or formally and descriptively, what we call rule consequentialism. And rule consequentialism is different. The focus, generally speaking, revolves around examining the results of what happens when people act according to a system of laws, codes, or rules. So this rule consequentialism follows all the same ideas of consequentialism, but with a backbone or framework of a legal system or ethical code. Rule consequentialism forces the moral agent to examine the innate goodness or badness of certain rules generally thought to be good or bad when that person makes a decision. In other words, doing something bad can sometimes be something good if it leads to maximized happiness in the consequences. Just take for example of the white lie or the lie that is done to save someone's hurt feelings. Now, does my new haircut make me look cool, for example, when someone asks you? All considerations and situations aside, most ethicists and most people really will say that, of course, lying is generally and usually wrong. It is not virtuous to be deceptive, and the truth is pure and good. So getting to know the truth is the overarching point of ethics and philosophy anyhow. But from a rule consequentialist's point of view, it's not necessarily bad. In some situations, telling the truth can maximize utility and also be a virtuous act. And that act in and of itself builds utility or is something that is assumed a good person would do. But rule consequentialism is explicitly about the situation. It's like that phrase, read the room, because rule consequentialists read the room of a situation on a case-by-case basis so that they may determine what is the best possible option to maximize utility in that situation. So depending on the situation, a usually moral act like telling the truth might not be the best option. A series of precise mental steps can be used to ascertain how to read a situation so as to come up with the best possible outcome from all the outcomes, with a focus on how a certain handling of long-held rules can maximize utility in the consequence. This mental process involves looking at the big picture of a decision. After all, this is rule consequentialism, and so a rule has to be taken to task before it can be acted upon. So going back to the example of the haircut, for example, this mental process involves these steps. Like as we have asked a while ago, does my new haircut make me look cool? So with these steps, first ask yourself what the world would look like hypothetically if everyone were to take on what you did as a rule. For example, lying to protect someone's feelings. Are you okay if this became a universally agreed upon positive behavior? If so, then it's moral. Then ask yourself what the world would look like. Again, you are considering the consequences if everybody did the opposite. For example, it would be okay to tell the truth all the time, no matter what, because lying is inherently wrong. In all likelihood, people would get upset a lot more often. Would you be okay with always telling the truth, regardless of situation? If that became a universally agreed upon positive behavior, then if so, this is the moral choice. Then looking at the two options, you must choose the option that would lead to the best consequences in terms of happiness.